hopefully opportunity after the meeting for people to send in their comments to the ESPA Directorate from what they've reflected on from the web streams and so on. So is that okay? So the program today is really a series of presentations to set the scene and maybe to help identify some of the issues which, or clarify some of the issues which Paul and I feel are a problem for us. And then we're going to have some open discussion session this afternoon. It may be within that session that you don't think there are any problems at all, in which case we can all go home early. But we would like some clarification and reflection in those sessions, at least, on what people have talked about, and some of these areas are probably quite contentious as well. So we're going to have that open discussion session this afternoon. We haven't got any pre-arranged questions, but I've got some things on my last slide which I hope we can focus on as we're going through these talks, because these are the things that are certainly energizing me at the moment, and I know are energizing the National Ecosystem Assessment follow-on phase in the UK, and certainly ESPA as well. So just to set the scene, I'm going to go through a number of slides to share my own prejudices about where I think the issues are in this rapidly developing field. So this quote here comes from a very provocative paper by Salva Harando Perez and a number of colleagues, which was published last year in Oikologia. And actually, it's got the Tower of Babel somewhere in the title. An enormous number of papers have Tower of Babel in the title these days, well, over the last 10 years, usually following a semicolon. And that's a guarantee for getting your work published. So those of you that don't know what the Old Testament Jewish story of the Tower of Babel is, shame on you, that's your homework for tonight. But basically, it's about how Yahweh, Jehovah, decided to confuse the languages of all the people in the world because they were getting too big for their shoes. And the way it's being used in modern parlance is to describe what you can see here on the screen. I'm not going to read it out. I think you get the general impression. But there are several things here which I think we need to reflect on as we go through this session. One is we have equivalent meanings for the same things now in much of the ecosystem literature. We have multiple meanings for the same thing, and actually there's an increasing number of people are coining new terms in order to perhaps express what are very complex things, but actually that only adds to the confusion for end users and practitioners, let alone researchers. And I'll come to some of those later on. So what we're really concerned with, and many of us here come from this kind of background, I hope, is the CBD's ecosystem approach, which actually you won't find a figure for anywhere on the CBD or in most of the government publications, including Natural England, JNCCC for the UK, and even the NEA. It doesn't lend itself, this is quite important, it doesn't lend itself to producing diagrams with that kind of heuristic framework. What there are, though, underlying the ecosystem approach is a number of principles, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, these so-called Malawi principles. And sitting at number 5 there is something which says something about ecosystem services. Now, the ecosystem approach, as you know, has been, I'm not sure it's the case at the moment, quite attractive to policymakers in Europe, including the United Kingdom, and overseas, because it puts environmental management squarely in the remit of society. It's a matter of societal choice, and acknowledges that we have to take economic and other considerations into account. Some of those considerations are not necessarily easily linked with some of the ecosystem service frameworks that we have at the moment. So there are things like equity, there are things like traditional knowledge, and a whole range of other principles which are in here. So I've highlighted number 5 there because what I know is happening in much of the activity in ecosystem services in the private and public sector now is that they've cherry-picked 5 at the exclusion of the rest. Apologies to Roy here, who's sitting here, but you did submit this. It is in the public domain. This is a framework for the relationship between biodiversity, ecosystem and well-being, which is a kind of mechanistic view of how natural capital delivers benefits at the end that we might use in society. And there are many different versions of this. And I have to say, you probably regret even publishing this in the first place, Roy, because it's been adapted and bastardized by all sorts of publications and probably twisted out of all recognition in some of the things I've seen. The idea here is that this is a framework. It is not an operational tool, but it is being used as such by many people who are applying ecosystem services as a way to manage the system. Here's another framework. This is one developed by Kerry Turner and Gretchen Daly. Not very well known, I think, because of the way the publication it came out in. This is the Ecosystem Services Framework. But it's, I don't think it adds to the confusion. I think it makes a real attempt to embrace and acknowledge some of those other principles that we saw from the CBD, and they're in here. Ecosystem services is a big box there, but we also have things like education, community strategies, legitimacy filters, benefits capture, capacity building, monitoring, these sorts of things. And the point that Kerry and Gretchen are making here is that it's actually quite difficult to implement an ecosystem services approach without acknowledging all those other principles within the CBD documents. This is also a framework. It's not an operational tool. It's a framework which bits of it are trying to be operationalized now. And one of the problems we have when we use frameworks like this or like this is they're box and flow diagrams. And as soon as a modeler sees that, well, that's great. I can fix that, and people will try and do this. This is not a tool, it's a framework. There are also other frameworks which are much more sort of conceptual, and this is the one that we use as a conceptual model. It's not a tool. Conceptual model within biodiversity and ecosystem service sustainability. It's about stocks, that's the lumps of natural capital, the biophysical processes and the ecosystem processes and so on, that deliver the flows which we eventually use as benefits. So grain from land and inspiration and aesthetic inspiration in particular from landscapes like that. Now that's a lot more woolly, but that's a framework, it's a conceptual base, and that's our working model. These are all frameworks. There are other frameworks out there as well, and we'll hear about one very similar one to this, although it's not done in the same way, I'm sure, WAVES, which is a wealth accounting system that the United Nations are very interested in. This is one from the Canadian boreal system. If you don't know the Canadian boreal system, then you should. It's one of the biggest ecosystems in the world and probably dominates lots of the biogeochemical cycles on our planet. And the Canadians really want to manage this holistically. So they've developed this accounting system, which some of you will see some resonance in with our own Natural Capital Committee approach and WAVES and so on. Again, it's a framework. It's a way of doing things. It's not actually a tool which you can use in any formal sense to manage that system. It includes things like natural capital stocks and flows on one side. Interestingly, it includes ecosystem services on the other. A lot of confusion here with researchers because they can't really work out what the differences are between them. It's a framework. It's a way of doing things. This is a tool, and these are the kinds of tools that are being used all the time now within the UK for on-the-ground practical environmental management. This is one which is a modification of, an advancement, should I say, on Polyscape, which some of you may have learned, know, and it's Lucy, Land Utilization and Capability Indicator, and the idea here is to present to stakeholders, so immediately public participation and the role of all the other principles is embedded in here. What kind of services can be delivered and potentially what their relative values might be at local scales. This is the Bassenthwaite. This is the Payment for Ecosystem Services pilot areas for Natural England. And this work's been done by Bethana Jackson and a number of other people. She's actually based in Wellington in New Zealand, but she has a part-time post in with Centre for Ecology and Hydrology at Bangor, working in Bridget Emmett's group. So it's the sort of thing they're doing already in Wales on the ground. And the key thing here is it's a GIS-based mapping tool, which is great. But actually, it's of no use at all to inform decision making unless you have, as Bethana recognises, the input from stakeholders and other people in the system. It has to be a participatory technique which is used in order to inform decision making. Decisions may not really be evidence-based, or they may be evidence-influenced, and this is some of the evidence, and the people who make the final decisions may ignore this evidence. That's not the point. It's a way to inform people, to give them more information. This is a tool. There are a number of such tools out there at the moment, and if you want to find out more about them, Elwick's just produced this practice note on how to locate and measure nature's benefits, which was a bit of a double-edged sword when we help them produce it, because it gives people power to actually go out using a geographical information system based approach and actually try to make some estimates of the actual amounts of ecosystem services from habitats using some kind of production functions and attach some values to them. Now, the reason people are doing this is not for intellectual, not necessarily for intellectual engagement, but because there are many end users and practitioners out there, this is just the UK, there are many abroad as well, who need the tools to do this. They are really turned on by the ecosystem approach. When we go to international meetings, and I'm sure it's the same with you guys here, they say this is all very well, how do we do it? So what we were at York asked to do was to provide an inventory of what's going on, not to judge what are the best tools, but what's going on in the UK in terms of locating and measuring nature's benefits. And these are where it's all going on. Each one of these is different. People are making up their own things. These tools are context dependent, context in terms of the policy and context in terms of the location. They have been developed at ground roots level for a particular issue. And the idea here is that you can click onto any of these and up comes the identification of the identity of the people who are doing that, where they are and how you can get in touch with them and what the basis of what they're doing are. Some are quite sophisticated, like the Lucy tool. Other ones are simple spreadsheets developed by a man, a woman and a dog somewhere in a wildlife trust. You know, that's how these things work. This here is a web interface, so you can just click on that, and it's on the BESS website. But if you go to the LWEC website, you can download this practice note, and all the information is on there. So thank you for pointing that out. That's very useful. And the idea here is then you don't have to invent your own tools. If you're living in Birmingham and you want to know how to do this, then you click on somebody near you and you go and talk to them. Okay? So what's happening here is people are very excited about this approach and they want to do it, but they can't wait for us in the academic community necessarily to deliver the tools for them and to make judgments about what are the right ones. Now, that's very encouraging in some way that people are signed up for the ecosystem approach and the ecosystem service framework in general, but what it does mean is that people are going off in all sorts of strange directions sometimes and probably not really understanding the full implications of what they're doing. So very few of these, for instance, and I have to say Lucy is not one of these who I'm talking about, but very few of these actually embrace all of those boxes and descriptions within the ecosystem services framework that I showed you by Kerry Turner and Gretchen. They're cherry picking the ecosystem services bit themselves, and often they're not participatory. Sometimes they don't involve a whole range of other things as well, and technically they can be quite challenging. So just to let you know that the genie is out of the bottle in terms of ecosystem service management, and that's part of the problem that we're trying to deal with today. However, there is hope. This is, and I haven't got permission to show this, so if there's anybody watching from UK NEA, I do apologise for this in advance, and I'm quite happy to be sacked from the team because I'm not being paid for it. But this is a fantastic initiative led by Alistair Scott from City University Birmingham, and this is something called the Ecosystem Approach Toolkit, how to mainstream the environment in planning. And he's called it the Eat Me Tree, which some people love, some people hate. I think it's quite good. And basically, it's a web-based tool where you can click on to any part of the policy cycle there. So this is supposed to represent part of DEFRA's policy cycle, the actual leaves on the tree there. You can click on a little bird. It's quite interesting. There are no blue birds that I know of within the United Kingdom, so this is obviously for tropical people. And then on the roots, there are also other buttons you can press on for particular tools. And what I want you to realize is that ecosystem services is only one tool in the toolkit box. There are lots of other tools in there which you have to use if you want to use the ecosystem services framework correctly. Valuation, regulatory tools, futures tools, which I think Roy might talk a little bit about later on, incentive tools, engagement tools, and so on. But they have to be set within that policy cycle. And what this does is try and identify what kinds of tools are needed for what stages of that policy cycle. This is a real holistic mainstreaming ecosystem approach. It's not available yet, so don't try and find it on a website. You just won't get it. There's an early version of it which you can get to through some kind of backdoors in national ecosystem assessment, but this should be out fairly shortly. And it's a very valuable service, and I think some of you may have well been involved with that as well as either experts or reviewers. So there are tools out there which people can use which explicitly state that you shouldn't cherry pick. You must use this holistic framework of the ecosystem approach, but a lot of people aren't doing that at the moment. So these are the questions that I think we should be thinking about today. What are the key frameworks? There are many out there. We've just shown you two. We've shown you the ecosystem services framework, kind of framework, which is a conceptual model, the sort of thing that Roy, I showed of Roy's. What are the key frameworks that we should be using within the UK and overseas? Because practitioners, end users, policymakers are pretty confused about what we should be doing. I suspect in this country, well, I know, in this country, in the UK, we are much further ahead in this than many other countries in Europe, probably the States, and many other parts of the world. So we tend to be a bit smug in thinking, well, we know how all this works. How can people be misinformed about this? Actually, most people are finding it very difficult to get through this morass of frameworks. How do these frameworks relate to the tools which have been developed and used by researchers and end users? And once you get into tools, usually you're only picking off a little bit of the framework. Hence, ecosystem services tend to be cherry-picked out of the ecosystem service framework. I suppose the third thing would be good to reflect on is, are practitioners using the tools correctly, let alone frameworks? And I suspect not. It's very easy to go onto a website, find a tool like Invest or something like that. You can download it onto your laptop relatively easily, and then away you go if you've got a GIS database, without any reference to anything else in the ecosystem approach. Are these frameworks useful or relevant to end users? Well, I guess I've already really said that. But I would like us to do as well is reflect very hard on whether they're going to be useful for the people that we're producing them for. And that's not necessarily overseas developing countries, but from other cultures and knowledge systems which we have in Europe as well. And one of the most difficult things that any of us has to do is stand in a field with a bunch of farmers in the UK and trying to explain this stuff. Those are the people that manage our natural environment in the UK. DEFRA doesn't. We might have some policies on it, but on a day-to-day basis, it's individual farmers which do that. Trying to get this kind of information over to them, certainly using scientific language, is just not on. We have to have a very different lexicon for that. And maybe our frameworks don't appeal to them either, because they have very different mental constructs about what biodiversity might be, about what services and benefits might be, about what a landscape is. They have a different knowledge system. And what we're doing now may not actually be appropriate at the end of the day. So we need to reflect on that all the time. Now, it doesn't mean to say we have to change what we're doing. We just have to be cognizant of the way people receive these kinds of frameworks and information. Can we, should we, identify best practice? I'm sure we could all come up with a prejudiced view of what works best, but actually, should we be doing that? It may be that a multiplicity of frameworks is required. That will only add to the confusion, I have to say, but it could be that there's a time and a place for particular frameworks and particular tools. But I think we should identify the best practice, and if so, how could this be communicated and promoted to end users, practitioners, and to other researchers who are just coming in and starting to nibble away at this very productive area of science. Okay, so that's the scene for today. This is your challenge, your mission. Should you choose to accept it, then that will be good. This PC will self-destruct in 5 seconds.
Okay, I hope it doesn't self-destruct because we need it for the rest of the day. We've actually got 5 minutes if anybody wants to ask. Any
clarifications about what
I've asked clarification?
Or comments? Maybe we've got it all wrong. Maybe Paul and I are asking the wrong questions.
If we haven't got a question, I'll just...
Oh, we do have two. One from Joe.
Okay, go for it.
Which one? Joe, do you want to go first?
Oh, wait a second. We need to just wait.
Joe Brown.
Just wait for a microphone.
From Cranfield.
Just wait.
Thanks, David. Joe Morris from Cranfield.
Joe Brown, Joe Morris. Shows my age, doesn't it, Joe?
I'd just like to ask the question what the underlying assumption is of these various frameworks and tools in terms of what the purpose is.
You'll have to unpack
and I'm thinking
more,
whether for example, is the underlying purpose an assumption about social progress, economic prosperity, and well-being. So that is the overall driver behind the application of these frameworks. Or is it some deep ecological commitment towards biodiversity in itself? So what is the underlying assumption that is driving this, that makes this offering useful?
Well, here's a lousy answer. All of the above. I've asked that same question as well. What motivates people to do these? And some people are motivated by, the pure research, because these are interesting intellectual problems. Some people are motivated by the higher order things that you mentioned at the beginning, well-being, social progress, and so on. Some people are motivated by the idea that what we've been trying to do with conservation of natural resources and biodiversity in particular over the last 30 years clearly hasn't worked because the planet is still in a mess and we need to try another approach. This one is more holistic and takes into account the full costs as well as the benefits. It internalizes all those externalities that were there before. And hopefully environments will be managed better from that point of view. So I think there's a real mixture here. I don't think there is a sort of an evangelical alliance here of people working in this area, all with the same motivation. They come to it for different purposes and backgrounds. What the political motivation is for promoting this within some of our regulatory agencies and government departments is not very clear either, and it probably depends on where you are in the policy cycle and the election cycle. So all the above, I think, Joe. I don't think people are coming to this from very different directions, and that might actually explain some of the different frameworks.
And just to follow up on that, I think it also relates to some of these questions that Dave put up. When you've got all of this huge range of objectives, is one tool going to be particularly well suited, or one framework, one set of tools particularly well suited to the policy domain as opposed to the conceptualization? I was in Bangladesh last week speaking to different stakeholders, and they all had different objectives and were saying, well, what do we do? If some were saying, we want to protect the environment. Others were saying, our prime objective is to reduce poverty. Others were saying, we want to increase industrial production. And they were all going in very different directions, but all wanting to use the same overarching concept. So I think there was another question.
Yes, Janet had a question.
Thanks very much for your talk, Dave. It's Janet Fisher, University of Edinburgh. I get the sense that to some extent you think there's a proliferation of frameworks, but it wasn't totally clear to me whether you think that's okay and we shouldn't try to standardize those frameworks and kind of converge on fewer, or whether you think just that the kind of critical thing is that those frameworks are better explained to those people who might use them in various ways, and they need to be kind of categorized so that people are better equipped with the, I suppose, knowledge to choose the right one for their purpose.
Well, no, that's an excellent question, and actually that's what I hope will emerge this afternoon. We need a view on that. It could be that actually these frameworks are fit for purpose in different contexts, as the tools might be fit for purpose in different contexts. The downside to that, of course, is that with a proliferation of frameworks, then we end up with a if we don't have some guidance on that, we end up with a problem for people who want to come into this de novo because they're not quite sure which ones are the ones they should be using. So that's actually a central question which I'd like everybody focused on today.
And just to add on that, I think Dave's first slide of the Tower of Babel is important. I'm completely open about whether it's okay or not to have a huge range of frameworks. The one thing which is really important, irrespective of that, is how we communicate this externally. If each framework has its own terminology, which is basically using a different word for the same concept, that confuses people. So I think there's the conceptualization, there's implementation, and the last bit is communicating this so that Dave's farmers don't tell them to get off their land because you're wasting their time.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't blame them. So I think, as there is a caveat there, we're just a small select group. It could be if we had another different 30 people here, we might end up with a different consensus. But from the point of view of BESS and the point of view of ESPA, and I think this would be generally useful for Natural Environment Research Council and maybe for other institutions as well, it would be good to at least have some reflection on this so that we can communicate that back to not only the people that pay us, but the people that might be using these things as well. It could be that, there might, I suspect, there are similar fora in the United States, and maybe even this very minute, considering these kinds of issues as well, in which case the answer might be quite different. But, that's no reason why we shouldn't walk away from making a stab at this.
And just